Right, so it looks like we are live. Excellent. So I'm not sure who's here yet, but looking at the viewer count, I think people are just going to start rocking up. So yeah, we're going to be starting fairly soon, but in the meantime, I figured I'd just kind of talk some historical crap, throw up some anecdotes or whatever. Really just to kind of set the scene, get going. One thing actually I've been kind of researching a little bit of, just really started today, was police cutlass. So something I think a lot of people maybe don't know is that in the Victorian period, and right up into the 20th century, in some places, police were actually issued with swords, specifically cutlasses, although I think also in some places they had sabres, which the reasons that are kind of interesting in of itself, because initially the police didn't have cutlasses as a sort of standard armament. And if you look at images of police throughout the 19th century, it's very rare that you see them actually wearing swords. But it's something that kind of gets busted out when the situation is a bit more severe, and in a lot of cases that was as a means of putting down civil unrest. So there's actually an image of the British police drilling Cutlass, which has this explanation of, the police have been issued cutlasses and are drilling with them, and they're actually doing a cavalry drill, which is interesting in itself. Because there's they're worried about like Chartist uprisings. So sort of this, it's kind of interesting that the police were kind of expected to function even then as kind of a internal-facing military to put down unrest. But anyway, we should probably get started with the actual lesson, historical anecdotes aside. So tonight we're going to be talking about distance and footwork, in combination of the two. Primary reason that I kind of do them together is I find that it's a lot easier to understand distance if you put in the context of how you manipulate it. And I also find it's a lot easier to understand footwork. Footwork if you if you've got kind of a goal for it. I used to do a lot of a lot of like footwork drills where you'd walk around to try and keep your head level, and you'd practice like the technique of footwork. But that very rarely translated for me to fencing. And outside of like physical training, the one thing that really helped me develop my footwork was actually putting it in the context of what I'd be doing with it in the bout, which was one, delivering attacks, but two, manipulating distance, which is what we're going to look at tonight. So it's kind of why I like to teach them together. Cool. So I've got a few questions already in the chat, so that's awesome to see that people are already getting really active. So it does make you wonder how effective the police thought if sending training people with cutlasses would be against a mob was meant to be termed as serious. I think, I don't know. The systems of fencing that the British had were fairly easy to like. You could learn them in an afternoon, and then after that, it's mostly bouting. This is kind of an interesting thing about British fencing culture. Was very, very kind of like combat sports orientated. So a lot of the saber advice is about just getting people to the point where they're competitive and they can play saber against each other or single stick. But I don't know specifically like what the intention was, but I think, in terms of actual like tactics on the ground. But one thing that's very, very clear is whenever the police talk about using or issuing cutlasses, they usually talk about it in the context of civil unrest, usually and quite often in relation to the Chartists as well, which is kind of interesting in itself, because the Chartists, for those who don't know, were like essentially a pro-democracy movement. They wanted universal suffrage, preferential voting, things like that. Cool, but yeah, cool. And if you're viewing this on Facebook, Olaf has actually posted a link to the police sword exercise manual, which, if it's the one I'm thinking of, is actually really, really similar to the 1845 infantry sword exercise by the 3rd Henry Angelo, which is kind of cool. All right, anyway, let's start out. And to start out, I was going to let's talk about the theory of distance. So let's have a look. So hopefully my screen is now sharing and you're seeing all right, is my sound back? That's all right. Can you hear me now?
You totally lost sound.
I think it's back now. Is it back now? Ah, cool. Yes, it's back. All right. So sorry about that. Should I go through these again? So yeah, basically this is Hutton's theory of distance. There's perfect measure, which is when on the lunge, without having previously moved the left foot, you can strike some part of the opponent. So this is the distance you fight at. This is the distance where it is safe from your opponent's attack. Because they will also have to put in footwork in order to attack you. The reason you want to stand at perfect measure for the most part is, even though being closer, being within measure, means that you can hit your opponent faster than they can reliably defend, they can do the same thing to you. And so you want to stand at a distance that turns fencing into a game of skill and tactics and cunning, all things that all people can, or most people can improve, as opposed to being a game of reflexes. Doubly so because with a game of reflexes, there's a more than decent chance that both people will lose. You then have being out of measure. So this is out of measure is when it is necessary to advance at least one step in order to be near enough to touch the adversary. So this is when you're out of the fight. This is when you're not able to do anything other than defend if your opponent is still able to attack you. And it is, and distance is often asymmetric because people are asymmetric. So there are times when one person will be at perfect measure and be able to attack, and the other person will be out of measure, and all they can really do is defend. Mix it. So in a one-on-one duel, primarily because I think, or any kind of combat situation when you're fighting with one opponent, this gets more complicated when you have multiple opponents and terrain and things like that. But like when you have multiple opponents, you might be like, oh, a perfect measure of this opponent, and that opponent's out of measure, and this opponent is within measure, and oh gosh, and the basic theory still stands, and this is a way of working out what attacks are, like what attacks and what defenses and what actions generally are the best to do. So the next thing you have is being within measure, which is when you are near enough to where you can be touched without lunging. So this is where a person can simply extend their sword and hit you. The problem with being within measure is that you can't always reliably defend. So an attack can just come in too quick, particularly if it's a deceptive attack like a feint. So whenever you are coming within measure of your opponent, you need to be occupying with something. Now, obviously, to an attack from perfect measure, you're going to come within measure of your opponent, and so the best thing, but you are safe by virtue of the fact that you're attacking them and you're making them do something. And once you've attacked and they've defended, you don't want to hang around because you're then within measure of them. The other exception to that is when you formed an engagement, and so you're forcing your opponent to move, like to disengage, disengage their sword in order to attack you. So which means you're basically slowing down their action, slowing down their attack enough that you can react to it. And the final distance, corps et corps, is when the combatants have come so close together that it's possible for them to grapple with each other. I find in terms of judging this distance, it's fairly intuitive what they're talking about. So perfect measure is when you can lunge and hit your opponent. Out of measure is when you can't do any single piece of any single action and hit your opponent. Being within measure is when you can hit your opponent on the extension. With corps à corps, it's a bit more. It can be a bit more confusing because the point where there's a point where you can be both within measure and at corps à corps. I usually judge it corps à corps by two factors. One being when you're so close that with your offhand you can reach out and grab your opponent without needing to step or without needing to move your feet, and maybe with at most a mild twist of your body. You're not needing, it's a very quick, fast motion to grab them. And the other point where you're at corps à corps and should act appropriately is when moving backwards, when taking a full step back, you'll still be within measure. You'll still be within extension distance. So you'll still be in danger of being struck. Right. So let's start looking at some of those ideas in the context of footwork. So what I get you to do, if you're following along at home, grab a weapon, or better still, grab multiple weapons. So I'm going to be using different weapons over the course of the night. And the reason for that is if you're doing these drills at home, what you should do is try them with different weapons, with weapons of different lengths. so that you can get used to judging distance with weapons of different lengths. Not just for your own benefit, for the benefit of changing weapons and going, all right, I know what distance is with this weapon now, but also for the benefit of learning how to judge distance in more versatile ways, so you can judge your opponent's distance as well. Because as much as it's very difficult, and certainly outside the limits of this workshop, being able to judge what distance your opponent is at, whether they're perfect measure, or out of measure, or within measure, or core to core, is really, really, really useful in a fight. So saying also, are we limiting ourselves to one-handed weapons, or a late stage good idea here? Well, I for one am going to be using a two-handed sword at some point tonight to demonstrate the versatility of this stuff. So no, you can certainly use a two-handed weapon. The one thing I'd suggest is that you want it to be a weapon or maybe a few basic techniques in, just to be safe, because I can't cover the basics of several different weapons in one workshop. All right, so to start off with, we're going to look at the most basic footwork for moving, which is stepping. In fencing terms, stepping is a specific thing, namely you step by moving your feet, but without crossing them. So this is a step, this is a step, this is a step, and this is a step. But if I do this is a pass, because my feet are passing each other. Which incidentally is where the term pace comes from. So you hear about pistol drills happening at 20 paces or 12 paces or whatever it is. With this, we're going to focus primarily on steps, because they're a slightly shorter movement, and until you're actually in combat and moving, I find you tend to use steps, even with two-handed swords. If I'm going to make a passing attack to get into that distance, I'm going to be stepping and manipulating my distance with these small movements. That's just a quick question in the chat. So someone wants to know, what do you force people to open an account before they can view your courses? So if you mean these online lessons, you don't need to open an account to view them via YouTube. They're all up and they're all open access. With our online course that we have through the website, the reason you need an account is it costs money. It costs $10 Australian, which is a bit over $5 US, and it's a bit hard to charge people money if they don't open an account. So yeah, that's kind of the nature of these. All right, so let's look at, so let's start looking at footwork. So we're going to start with, let's get in a basic fencing stance. To do that, what you do is just put your feet in L like this, with your sword side foot, or if you've got a two-handed weapon, your dom. We're going to start with our dominant side back. But for one-handed weapon, let's start with our sword side foot forward and our offside foot behind it. So there's a straight line between our back heel, our front heel, and our toes. And go like this. Then from here, what I want you to do is move your feet to be about roughly 2 foot widths apart. Can be a little more, can be a little less, depending on your preference and what's comfortable. And I want you to come down to a nice, comfortable squat. And the reason I want you to come to a squat is because when you do footwork, if you're standing bolt upright, one of two things will happen. One is you'll bend your knees to step forward and then straighten again, meaning you've got 2 superfluous movements, or you'll step in a very pendular fashion, which is a very committed footwork, and it's generating a lot of movement around the body, which is very telegraphic and a lot more committed. Whereas if my knees are bent, I can keep my upper body fairly straight. Obviously, there's going to be a bit of movement because I'm moving around quite vigorously, but it's a lot less, and these my movements are a lot less telegraphic. From here, let's just keep all our weapons behind our back, or if you don't want to carry a weapon at all, you can just put those down. But let's look at stepping. So let's start by stepping forward. The way you step forward is you just kick your front foot out. So I'm just extending out onto my heel, and then rolling onto my heel, and bring my back foot up. Step out, and I'm rolling onto my heel, bring my back foot up. And I find when you do this with the roll, it helps to think about rolling onto the outside of your foot, because that makes you a lot more stable and prevents your knees from dipping in. So when I'm standing, I don't want my knees to dip in like this, because you can see I'm almost already falling over. I want to keep my knees pushed out, because that keeps me a lot more stable. So what I do instead is I kick out, I roll onto the outside of my foot, and then move my back foot up. And then to go in reverse, all I do is the same action but reverse. So if I'm doing a retreating step, I move my back foot out, and then I push off, I raise my toes, push off, and come back, and then roll onto my heel, and then roll from my heel to my toes again. So step out, push off, and cut, and then roll onto my toes from my heel. And the other thing that's very, very important with this footwork is not universally, but the vast majority of the time, what you want to do is make your feet wider and then narrow again. You don't want to step your feet together and then apart, because this means you have a moment of instability. When your feet are close together, you're more wobbly, your base is more narrow, whereas when your feet are farther apart, you're much, much, much stronger. So, what I want you to focus on, we're going to practice this, what we're going to focus on is stepping back and forth, but I want you to focus on going wide to narrow. So, just move to the back of your training room. I'm actually going to put my sword down so I can really get a bit extra room. And let's focus on forward, stepping, just keep going. Make sure you lift your feet off the ground. And when you get to the end of your training area, I want you to start moving back by reversing movement. So step up, and move back. Up, move back. Make sure you lift. It's very, very easy on a smooth surface to slide your feet along. But if you're on, say, wet grass or gravel, or doing this in a bush, or things like detritus on the ground, or even I actually find even on flat concrete, dragging your feet slows you down and risks tripping. And I have seen one person trip over this. For the most part, when people lose their balance, they don't fall over; they just stagger off balance for a second. But if you're being mean, you'll still hit them then. But if you lift your foot, you will clear any obstacle. And the other thing as well is, as I come down my heel, if I'm stable, I can rock my body weight back and pull myself out of the situation. So I've got a lot of versatility in this footwork and change. Quite useful. Okay, let's look at a question. So the movie is how I was taught to step for sword fighting. So actually, what's behind leading with the heel? I find it helps in mud, but makes skidding on hard surfaces or on surfaces on the ground. So short answer. It does depend on what shoes you're wearing, and also the shoes. Just as in the bit of an aside, in modern Olympic, there's this movement, what they call natural footwork. With natural footwork, basically you just land on your toes, lunge and bounce, which is very, very natural if you're used to shoes with heels that are like a centimetre off the ground. So we're not talking, we're talking about shoes or like unisex business shoes, I guess. Wearing period shoes, or historical, most flat, thick piece of leather sole. When you step forward, digging in with the sole actually gives you stability. Well, with mud, with gravel, with really anything, whereas any surface, because you've got essentially this edge that gouging help give you stability. And if you spend a lot of time walking in those shoes, you start to do this sort of thing instinctively because it's more stable. So hopefully that answers your question. Obviously doing this on different surfaces is a good idea. And if you do find that you're naturally moving towards stepping your toes, doing more sort of modern kind of step, it's that, sometimes I call sort of fighting. There are some aspects where bodies are not the same as those of historical people because we live in a different environment. You've not found a 19th century manual that talks about the computer shoulders because very rare to sit hunched over a desk all day. So they didn't have the same problems with hunched backs today. Conversely, and this even extends to walking differently because their shoes are different and the surfaces they're walking on, at least for the North American stuff, where our city is much more modern. So yeah. But I find that doing these drills on different surfaces really helps you develop your footwork and versatility within your footwork. Alright. So let's go through. So the back of your training area, stepping forward, rolling onto the heel, rolling onto the heel and back. And then just once more. And forward. That way. Alright, cool. So now let's grab our weapon, and now let's add a distance component to that. So what I want you to do with your weapon is I want you to move to a wall, preferably one you can poke. I want you to just walk up to it and come to extension distance. So you're placing your arms at full extension, and you're placing the placing your tip gently on the wall. I want you to come to guard. In this case, for a saber, all I'm doing is bending my arm to 90 degrees, keeping my tip about shoulder height, so that if I need to thrust, I can just extend. And if I need to chop, I can just extend and chop. So I sort of dealt with this guard in the previous lesson, which you can see on my YouTube channel and also on my Facebook, because shameless self-plug. Right, from here, what I want you to do is walk, or just do proper steps, all the way back to the other end of the training area. And from here, we're going to walk into distance. So we're going to walk to the point where we're within measure of the wall. What we're going to do, walk. And when we get to where we think we are at just extension distance, we're just going to extend, tap the wall. If for the sake of argument, let's say you're just a little bit back and you're a bit out and you're like, oh, I'm having to lean. What I want you to do is adjust so that you're back at your extension distance and you can see where it is again. Come back to guard and repeat the drill. And don't be afraid, like if you don't get it perfect, don't go all the way back and try it all the way again. What I want you to do is just walk over, gently step towards the wall and extend. Retract. Adjust if you need to, and practice proper fencing steps. You really want to get into the habit of going wide to narrow and of lifting your feet. And to be honest, if you do a more modern kind of like modern boxing, modern fencing variant where you're leading with the toes, so for reference what I'm talking about, a lot of modern combat sports, they'll step out with the toe and come down onto the heel as they bring the foot back up, or down, or just down so the heel is lightly touching. maybe more bouncy footwork. If you find that you're doing that and that's more comfortable to you, and you maybe, particularly if you're a beginner, it's fine to practice that and use that as a bridge towards developing more period footwork. I went through a stage of about 2.5 years of doing basically that kind of footwork because it meant that I had a functional combative footwork, which then let me understand why footwork worked and develop more period footwork from there. But, you know, if you can, practice the period footwork as well. So now, if you can, let's change what weapon we've got. So I'm going to put my saber down. I'm going to get out my trusty boffer knife. So from here, the drill is exactly the same. We walk up to one more extension distance of the wall, a target. If you've got a boxing bag or something that works equally well, good to go. So I'm stepping all the way back. All the way back to your training area as far back as you can, so you get as many reps of the foot in, and extending, and then coming forward until you think you're at extension distance. Stop, pause and check. Come back to guard. If you're too close, make some adjustments so that you're again at exact extension distance from just touching, and then walk all the way back. And the goal of this drill is to teach you to measure that distance down to a hair, down to like a hair's width. And I think, like, if you're looking for a drill to do at home, doing that just, you know, a few repetitions of this every day with different weapons is a really, really good way to kind of improve your fence. Right. Now, I'm going to do it with one last weapon. This is a weapon I'm quite fond of. That's my fist. So the same principle applies, at least in the case of bare knuckle boxing. I don't want to speak for all martial arts, because I know there's some very different philosophy in each. But at the very least in bare knuckle boxing, same ideas apply. Just going to walk up to the wall, lay my fist on the wall so I know what my extension distance is, and this is specifically my extension distance. I might actually need a bit of a jab. Come back to my guard, go all the way back, all the way forward again, and come to extension distance. So yeah, so that's the first kind of footwork distancey drill. I'll just quickly check for questions while we're here. Has anyone got any questions before we move on and look at the next bit of footwork? Right. That looks like a no. So let's move on. So I'm going to grab my trusty saber, less radically called Cutlass. Interestingly enough, R.G. Lynn, is one of the authors we work from, says basically, he says when he talks about sabers, he talks about like heavy cavalry sabers. When he defines a Cutlass, he says they're shorter and lighter, which this is shorter than my other sabers and lighter than all but one of them. But usually what's described as a Cutlass is shorter than this again, or not necessarily lighter. So this is kind of a midpoint, but I like it. Alright, so what we're going to look at is lunging. Oh, we've got a question. It says, so it's the same footwork as for bare knuckle boxing. Yes, it is. And there's a lot of overlap between 19th century boxing footwork and 19th century fencing footwork. And one of the changes you see at the start of the 20th century that continues, well, continues all the way up to the present day, is that the footwork of boxing and footwork of fencing start to diverge at some point in the early 20th century. But certainly pre-World War I. So if you look at there's footage of World War I era boxing training, and the footwork is distinctly different to fencing training. So we're going to look at the lunge. So I'm going to come on guard, and all I'm going to do, and for my lunge, this is my kind of principal attack in 19th century systems, going back as far as the Renaissance, with big long rapiers and things like that. And then before that, they tended to use passing steps, which I will touch on very, very briefly. But with a lunge, what I want to do, extend my sword out. I want to cover myself, but I also want to put out a threat so that my opponent's got something that they're reacting to, they know they have to react to without actually hitting it. They can't just countercut. And from here, I want to kick my front foot out onto my toes. I'm not actually extending that much further than I would on a step. I might be kicking a bit more vigorously, but not a lot. And I roll from my heel all the way onto my toes, but I'm also driving as fast and hard as I can with my back leg. And the goal of doing that is that this movement is much faster and more violent than stepping, which is why it's useful. You know, I've got a bit of distance time to react, but not as much as if I stepped in and out. And what I want is for my toes to hit the ground at the same point where my sword gets to full extension, when it hits its target. Hopefully, assuming it's not parried. And from here, as my sword cuts all the way through, as I want to do, I lift my toes up, I start to push up with my front foot, but I also bend with my back leg and pull. And so I can pull myself out of danger as quick as I can. And this is kind of important to remember with lunging, so I want to get out as fast as I got in. So I extend, kick, I lunge, and I retract. And as I retract, I don't actually come back to guard until the last moment. So extend, kick, retract. So, how far is you coming forward in the lunge? Is it going further than your toes? Leading the edge rolls is fine. Short answer is here, you don't want your knee to go further than your toes. You don't want to be doing this. One, that can actually injure your knee quite badly, especially if you're doing it vigorously and over a period of time. But also, this is really unstable, and you can feel it. If you just stand in a stance, and you rock your knee forward, at about the point where it gets past your toes, you're going to start feeling a lot of tension in your calf and your thigh, because your muscles are working overtime to hold you up. Whereas as long as your knee doesn't go up past your toes, you've still got a lot of legal support. You've still got a lot of, you're mostly supporting yourself with the shin bone in order to keep yourself up. Whereas if your knee is too far forward, you're destabilized yourself. The other thing to remember about knees, I'll show you this from the front, is you don't want your knee to drift in. So when I come to a full lunge, I'm pushing my knee out. And this is why when I do my lunge, as with my steps, I want to roll on the outside of my foot to push my knee out. Because from here, basically my joint's locked and there's nowhere forward to go. So I'm fairly stable. Gravity isn't going to stabilize me. Whereas if my knee is in, I'm now having to use all of my muscles to fight gravity. I don't want to do that. In fact, I'm going to stop because it's going to my legs. And I'm very, very unstable and can fall over. I want to be as stable and as strong in the lunge as possible, but I also want that stability to come from my skeleton, from my skeletal alignment, because that means my muscles can do the job of moving me quickly, whereas if my muscles are busy holding me up, preventing me from falling over, it means that they can't move as quickly. I can't put as much effort into bouncing in and out. So with my lunge, what I'm going to do is extend, kick, lunge, retract. 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 extend, kick, lunge, retract, act. So let's try that now as one movement. As much as I did break that down in an order, so you extend first, then kick, then lunge, then retract. When I'm doing it as a single call, I want you to still try and have that order. It doesn't have to be perfect. You don't have to have your fully extended by the time you lunge. Just having it extending is generally good enough. But that's what you want to aim for, is this sort of order of extending all the way out and then letting your sword pull you in. I'm just going to call lunge a few times, and I want you to now do that movement, but vigorously, or in all one go. So, lunge, 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 and lunge. And just to show you and kind of make a point about various, varying weapons, you can actually do this movement with two-handed weapons. And it's sort of implied in Hutton's two-handed sword system that he thinks this is the thing you do. As far as I know, there's not really lunges in any medieval or Renaissance sword systems. This is an adaptation that Hutton made of 19th century footwork. But it is a really common thing in great stick, in the big two-handed stick systems of the 19th century, where they do a lot of attacks on the lunge. So on guard, my front arm is doing basically what it does with the sword, and my backhand is just kind of along to the right, keeping my elbows tucked. If you not feeling broadsword attacks, and all I do is extend, kick, lunge, retract. So let's just practice that, and I'll get you to change weapons. Doesn't have to be to a two-handed weapon. I'm just using this for sake of example, but I feel like it makes the point. So lunge, 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 and lunge. Right. Cool, so that's lunging just as a basic movement. So now let's look at putting that in the context of distance, of, in this case, perfect measure, which I'm going to refer to as lunge distance, or at least our Travis of T. So, because this is a very, very important distance to be able to recognize, we're going to do a similar variant of the drill we just did before, except what we're going to do is come to our big wall, extend, we're going to move our front foot forward, we're basically going to come to the reverse of a lunge position, and then we're going to lunge, and then we're going to move back. And just to check, we're just going to lunge, do it gently and slowly, and something about lunging in basically pre-20th century systems is the lunges tend to be a lot shorter and more cautious, because you don't want to be caught in distance, particularly with larger weapons like these. There are examples of people doing foil and small sword where they're doing these incredibly long, like almost doing split lunges. But a lot of manuals of swords, saber, Cutlass, specify that your lunge should be about 4 of your foot widths, so just double the length of your stance. And the reason for this is I want to make sure I don't overcommit, because I don't want to be caught within measure, particularly with a weapon this heavy. We're talking about a weapon that's like 650 grams, because if I'm parried, my opponent essentially has the initiative, and they can hit me faster than they can hit me quite quickly if I'm that close. So from here, let's walk all the way back to our training area. And all we're going to do is, in our stance, step forward, proper steps, until we come to our lunge distance. And we're just going to do a nice lunge, tap the wall, come back, and step all the way back. And yeah, sometimes we'll be taking like 1 or 2 steps. One thing to avoid is don't try and count the steps. And be mindful that you might do it subconsciously. You want to be able to judge this by sight. Or, if you're me and are looking at what you're broadcasting by what you see in the screen. But you do want to judge this by forward-looking sight. So you want to come to really, what you think is lunge distance. Do a lunge, come back, and all the way back. And if you're finding that your training area is too small, like you're like, well, I can't avoid counting 2 steps because 2 is such a small number. Go out, take half a step back, 2 steps forward, half step back, another half step back, a half step forward, and then walk from there when you've thoroughly confused yourself. And reach out, tap. And all the way back, and forward, extend, tap, back, and get forward, extend, lunge, tap, and all the way back, and forward again, extend, lunge, tap, all the way back, and just slow, careful walking, and forward. I find this is also a really, really useful drill to do. And I find that, particularly if you're working from home, where you're working, you want to get up, move around for just 5 minutes, doing 5-10 minutes of this is going to really, really help your fencing game. All right, so I'm going to change weapons again. This time I'm going to my trusty épée. Sorry if it's a little hard to see, but hopefully you'll have the idea by now. But the drill is exactly the same when you change weapons. Start, come to extension, I walk backwards, I come back to my guard, and be like, so that's my lunge distance. Move all the way back. I need to take little half random steps and shuffle a bit to confuse myself. Move forward, come to lunge distance. So you can change weapons. One thing you'll notice is I sporadically switch between this guard and this guard being a standard medium guard across foil, saving knife, whatever, and this being Jules Jacob's recommended épée guard. And it doesn't really matter in terms of the length of my lunge, because how far I lunge is primarily determined by where my back foot is. This also means that if I'm backweighted stance, my lunge is still the same distance. It's something you can do to really mess with your opponents is you can move, and you can change whether you're forward-weighted, mid-weighted, or back-weighted as a way of confusing them with the distance. So if they're used to finding out the mid-weighted stance, they might feel like, oh, that's what I know what Tim is. Oh wait, Tim's now back-weighted. And I've hit them because they haven't quite realized how close I am. Alright. Cool, so that is the next drill. That's moving into lunge distance. If you do have training partners at home, one thing that is also a really good idea is do the same drill, except have your training partner do a lunge or move to extension and come back, and try to then step forward and see how close you can get to that distance without actually being in it. Like if you can be just a millimeter out of their distance, That's perfect, because being able to judge an opponent's distance is as important, if not more important, than being able to judge your own. All right, so let's look a little bit at another type of footwork we see that I did promise to look at, and that's passing. So if I've got like a big two-handed weapon, or if I've got an opponent that I want to get close to, so I want to get to grappling distance, what I will do is I'll pass. So passing steps are a little different. It's a shoulder guard. The shoulder guards are more traditional of medieval stuff. I don't know, I don't actually do very much medieval sword fighting. That's what I do is 19th century. So if I say something wrong about medieval fencing, you're more than welcome to correct me. Actually, if I say anything wrong about any kind of anything, you're more than welcome to correct me. What I'm going to do with this is with the passes, what I want to do is I want to pivot and I want to rotate my feet. So pivot on my foot and rotate my feet. But to show you that from front, what I want to do is step, so I'll go from wide to narrow. I'm actually arcing my feet a little bit. And this has two benefits. One is it helps me clear my hips, so there's no chance of my heels clipping. Not that there is much chance of that once you get used to moving, but it can be useful for applications. But the other thing is, there's never a point where I'm bolt upright or my feet are together and I'm really, really unstable. And sure, even if I'm stable here, I get knocked backwards, I can still bail out at a direction. Whereas if I'm unstable like this and I get knocked backwards, I'm basically falling backwards and trying to keep my feet. Because so far use that two-handed in the apocalypse. I don't know what sort of use in the apocalypse. Yeah, so the basic idea is with passing footwork, and I'll pivot to come to just shoulder width apart. Not doing I can do lateral movements, but I don't need to. Shoulder apart, and then forward back to my fencing stance. So if you see where my front foot is, there's currently my front foot. When I pass, I'm coming to shoulder width. I'm moving opposite line just that little bit, which is bouncing, and then coming back to it. Or if I'm moving backwards, I'm circling around my stationary foot. And that's kind of the idea behind passing steps, is that I'm basically kind of arcing a bit. And this kind of has a lot of unsurprising applications with lateral movement, where if I'm kind of arcing my feet, I can actually use it to move off center line and change my angle. Not necessarily to avoid a direct attack, but what that does do is change the angles at which I'm attacking, which means I can make my attacks wide and narrow without needing to adjust what I'm doing with my hands, which is kind of useful. So now let's look at that in the context of attacking our wall or boxing bag, or whatever it is our target is. So I want you to come to basically full extension of your pass all the way back, just do your regular steps. So these steps are what we use to manipulate distance when we're not attacking. And then move to where you make your passing attack. Making adjustments you need. And back. Move forward to where you make a passing step. Pass, reach out and touch. And you really want to make your fullest extension. I mean, a little bit of bending your arms, but not quite full extension. It's I guess okay. But you don't want to be sort of too close like this. You don't want to be like that. Don't be so if you swing too hard and break your window. So moving forward, we reach, when you think you're at passing or attacking distance, move forward to attacking distance. You feel like the end came too close that time. Just move back, adjust so that you can adjust as you go, because that also teaches you to adjust and fly, which is a really useful skill in sword fighting. And come back, and step all the way back. Distance. Forward again, extend. And right. So yeah, that's how you judge distance and pass. Oh. Thank you, Hunter. I really appreciate that. All right. Cool. So before we move on and look at manipulation of distance from a slightly different perspective, I might just stop and see if there are any questions, anything anyone wants to ask. We're sort of, getting kind of towards the end of what I was planning on teaching, so I thought I'd check if there's any questions or just anything anyone wants to know. If you're furious to type in, if you want a recommendation about how to develop your distance with outside of solo exercises, so there's we will have an online course on distance and footwork. It should be going up at some point in the not too distant future when I write the thing. For reference, the online course is a lot more content than you get with me. I think I got up to nearly 20,000 words with the first lesson that we have up now. That's not including images and videos and everything like that, but we do cover lots of solo drills and as well as partner drills, and it is structured the way you would run a lesson. So if you want to get into teaching this stuff but don't really have much experience, you can just get the course and use that as kind of your template. But if you want advice on how to really develop your distance, particularly if you're doing other forms of sword fighting, knife. Outside the fact that a bit of insulation foam and some PVC pipe, or this one's actually a cold steel or plastic, like polypropylene trainer covered in padding to make it a bit safer. But you can make knife trainers really cheap. All you really need is a fencing mask and some decent-ish gloves. Some people do it with just like Olympic fencing gloves. I personally prefer to use like lacrosse gloves or a dragon glove, just because I find fist bumps can be a bit painful if you're not careful. I had one person, they made wear boxing gloves with a knife fighting because they kept accidentally punching one of the training partners in the chest. But yeah, really, really easy one to get into, and because you can't really parry this thing, it's so short, it's a really, really good way to learn distance, because that's, in terms of safely landing attacks and also in terms of safely defending, learning to control and manipulate distance, is really is like 80% of knife fighting. Once you know the basic techniques and applying the distance, knife will teach you to manipulate that distance effectively. Alright. Well, if there's no questions, we might keep going. I might touch on some of my favorite distancing tricks. So these are things I use to manipulate distance with footwork, just when I'm bowing, or when I want to deceive someone of their distance. So one of the things I do is I shift my weight. So from here, you can see if I bring the sword in front of me, the sword is pointing roughly between, equal distance between my feet. And so I'm roughly in alignment. It doesn't need to be perfect, but close enough. If I'm fighting from here, like you can see front on, my body is at a set distance. But if I shift it back weighted, it looks like I've moved further away, when in actual fact, I have not. Because what determines my lunge distance is my back foot. So something you can do, I recommend when you're adjusting distance, is just shift occasionally to being back weighted. I find it's particularly useful if you come forward and shift to back weighted, or shift to being back weighted as you come forward. because that will teach you just that little bit of distance. And it's a really, really good way to kind of sneak that much closer to your opponent without them quite realizing. And also, I find actually once I've shown this to people who are a lot shorter than me, they end up using it against me in some cases quite effectively, which is good and bad. Good from a teaching perspective, bad from not getting hit by my training partner's perspective. Although I guess also having good training partners is good, largely because it's just more fun, and it's not really that fun if you're constantly winning EBS. I think it's really good quickly, whereas having people who can challenge you is much more engaging. But yeah, if you're moving and you're constantly making little adjustments against someone, and then you make adjustments where you shift your weight to being back weighted, off being middle weighted, your opponent will often think you're further away than you are, which means that sometimes you can catch them unawares, or even get that little bit more extension impetus into your lunge. So that's kind of one of my distance tricks. That's one of the ones I use as a way of cheating my way into distance. Another thing that I use sporadically is I try to create angles. So what I do is I basically break line. And the way I do that is I change where my back foot is. So I like to move my back foot wide. If you've done like 18th century systems, you do see this kind of traverse where you get to a wide stance and a narrow stance, to a wide stance, narrow stance, reasonably often in angles. But it is something that's really useful to do, even though it's a technique that's occasionally mentioned in like 19th century angles, mostly by Hutton, who was also a big fan of historical fencing, and like was going back and trying to sort of cherry pick cool stuff from previous periods. Well, the other thing I'll do is I'll cross my back foot back. I know that you're not meant to do this, but it's kind of okay as a moment here. I'll cross my back foot back, and so when I lunge, I will change it so I can stand directly in front of the camera, and you can all see the yellow tile with the brown tile behind me. When I'm advancing, I might move. I might stick my foot out. Just stick my foot wide. If there's my opponent's not paying attention, they might not notice. When I attack, I've created an angle. I've come at them at a slightly different angle to what they're expected, and that sets up a different dynamic in the attack. So, if I say, let's say, props wide, I lunge, very quick movement. I now know whatever my opponent is going to do to me is going to come on this side until they take a step to reface. If they take a step to reface, I've got time to do something else. I've gained a tempo on them. So the technique for this is you step, either comes back or comes forward. Let's focus on the incretata, this step to start with. Move, you step and lunge. And your lunge is not direct. There is a key to that. You still want to point your toes at your target, but if you are doing that, if you're pointing your toes in, you want to drive your knee out. You want to push your knee out so that you're still stable. And that will keep you and pointing your toes in will mean you face your opponent, because where your toes point, your sort will follow, but you'll also stay stable because your knee is being pushed wide. Let's try it again, and I'll get in front of the I don't know if it's brown or orange, but the shield that isn't red and black, basically. So, step. And the more I can do this with minimal movement of the body, which is very hard when you're trying to do it slow and demonstrate, is kind of difficult. But you can see how it comes across as a very quick shuffle to come in. And because I've made that slight distance adjustment, that slight angle adjustment, I've cheated distance in a weird way, because now my opponent, through a direct attack, has to come at me from this side, and my sword is already there. So here, step and lunge. Step and lunge. I'll try and move back and front the same shield every time so you can see the difference. But step and lunge. Let's go. So we just got some good questions. Is the step the step behind step? Short answer, no. And you can you can tell from my demonstration when I do this. You can see how much I'm really falling back to restabilize. The way you keep it stable is you basically do it as quickly as possible, and you try and conceal it in other footwork. So if I'm stepping back and forward, maybe just try to keep my toe, keep my foot on their toes, make sure that I realize, and then I go. I need to do it as quickly as possible because I need to point out it's not a very stable step, but if I do it quickly enough, I can regain stability in flight. In fact, the only real point that you're unstable is when you're still on the same line but your foot slipped off. And once my foot's down and I lunge, I'm basically correcting regaining stability in flight, which hopefully makes sense. And then there is the other and hopefully much more stable method of gaining an angle. And I find this is the more popular one, but which makes the incrotata, this step, kind of more useful because people don't see it coming. And all I do is I also move back and forth. I creep my back foot out so it's now wide, and then I lunge. And again, I point my toes out, I drive my knee out, I put my toes to my toe, I drive my knee out, and I throw an attack. And that means all of a sudden I've gained an angle on my opponent. So the technique is step, traverse, and lunge. Traverse 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 and lunge. Traverse, lunge, and on top of luck, traverse and lunge. Right. Cool. And where these small movements are probably the most useful, interestingly enough, is with knife. Hopefully, I did a bow and knife workshop last year, which you can watch on our YouTube channel, but this year, depending on COVID and other restrictions, there's every chance that I'll be doing another knife workshop at some point. So there we go. But when you're with a knife, the principal target is the weapon hand. There's no hand protection, and there's no real protection in the knife. So the only way to safely attack is to attack the knife arm. It's attack the knife arm where the other person can't really reach you as you're coming in. If I go for someone's head with a knife, they can reach my knife. They can attack my knife arm before I can reach their head. If I go for their knife arm, by the time they can react, I'm already calling out. So now when I've got my knife, things I want to do is break line attack. 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 And so on. And sometimes the best time to do this, interestingly enough, is whilst retreating. So if I've got someone who I might want to keep at bay, I might take a step or two back, and then on my second step, 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 and that's when I relaunch my attack. because I've changed line, I've changed angle, and I'm drawing my opponent in, they're trying to chase me down. And then all of a sudden they've got to deal with one, a rapid about face, and two, a change of angle. Right. Cool. So here, there's not any more questions. I do have more cool things to show you. In fact, let's have a look at that, that particular sort of technique I just kind of alluded to. Which is that rapid change of direction. There's something that works really, really well in épée, which what I might do just to make everyone else easier, except for mine. I'm just going to put this épée in its sheath, PVC pipe sheath, but that should just be a bit more visible on the camera for you. Right. So if I'm fencing, because when it's not in a PVC pipe, this work is very quick and deceptive. In a lot of cases, people will defend by distance, and if they don't know what their opponent's doing, they'll back up. So what I can do is just move my tip, slightly start backing up if my opponent's doing something, and I'll do this side on. Hopefully it's not going to crash into a wall. So I might back up, and as I finish my next step, I stamp the ground and launch into a lunge. So what I'm doing is I'm stamping down as hard as I can when I do that backward step, which will then fire me forward. The person I actually used to learn it from had reckoned that the more inertia you build up going backwards, the more speed you have going forwards. I don't know if that's how physics works. I suspect it's not. But it does feel like that. And I suspect that a lot of the reason why it feels like that is primarily because you're coming back with such speed and such unexpected force. So the technique, we'll just show it with one step for easy practice, is I step, and before I settle, I don't want to come all the way back to a guard. While I'm still wide of the step, I stamp down, stamping the ground as hard as I can, then come back forward. So, step back, stamp, and come back forward. And take a few steps back so you can destroy your windows. So, step back, stamp, and come forward. And same rules of the lunge apply. Basically, as soon as I decide to stand, and I use my heel hitting the ground as a cue. When my heel hits the ground for the stamp, I rock up my hand forward as quickly as I can, so that I'm coming in covered by my sword. So, step, stamp, and come back in. Step, stamp, and come back in. And there are times when you'll do this. A lot of times you'll do this when you grab your back foot. But I was told dragging the back foot is bad. I don't know why. I wasn't told why. I was just told it was bad. And so I tried to not do it. And then there was a point where I finally succeeded in not dragging my back foot. And I started falling on my ass every time. So if you're rocking forward, sometimes you just have to bring your back foot up to stay stable. So back stamp. And lunge. Step back, stamp, 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 and lunge. And for reference, I was being quite lazy because I was about 3 times. I was drastically heavier and poorly balanced because of the PVC pipe. But when you do this, the best thrust to do this with is a thrust in tips, using my hand in this angle and coming in as a thrust to my opponent's outside. because that I find thrusting in tierce gets the best and the strongest opposition. Whereas like thrusting in car, my opponent can lift their hand up and come over the top and still hit me. Whereas thrusting in tierce, I get the strongest control. The other application for this, if you're into take this out. A better idea, I'll just do it with the saber. Or even better still, the PVC pipe, because it's white and you can see it. But one of the other applications of this exact same technique is I step back, I stand, and rather than thrusting, I beat. So I step back. What I want to do is move, possibly with a disengage, or possibly with a slight movement of my opponent's sword, and I beat. So the technique of that is I basically push, I just place my opponent's sword, and then I ride it down, straight down the so that what happens is it gets pushed slightly aside up here, and as my hand comes down, it gets more and more pushed aside, just because I'm basically shearing through it. And that can be quite effective and quite quick way of controlling your opponent's sword as you come in with a very, very rapid attack. So yeah, those are most of my favorite distance tricks. Yeah, just sit down for a sec. So are there any further questions before we wrap up? Wrap up the evening? Or any comments? Like, you know, anything anyone wants to kind of add, or just, you know, any thoughts in general? All right, that looks like no. Oh, thank you, Zoe. Yeah, cool. All right. Well, if there's no further comments or questions or anything like that, oh, thank you, Nick. Actually, I'll just stroke my ego. I'll check up the in the chat. Yeah, no, sparring is going to be good. Mick just can't wait to try these in sparring. Yeah, no, I agree. Actually, weirdly, just on the subject of sparring, so none of you I subscribe to, but there is this belief that you should reserve the term sparring specifically for unarmed martial arts, and the term for like weapon martial arts, you know, or like sword with, you know, swords is bouting. Near as I can tell, this is, I don't know when this delineation started, or even if it's just, or even if it is anything other than just a modernism. But I use the term sparring and bouting interchangeably for every martial art I do, armed or unarmed. But just interestingly enough, with boxing, that same idea of just stamping down to rapidly come forward does work quite well. You don't stamp quite the same way, so I don't necessarily like step back and stand. You can bare knuckle, certainly bare knuckle is exactly the same footwork. But if you're doing a modern style of boxing, which most boxing is actually quite modern, much as I love such martial arts. You can stand, and you basically drive your heel into the ground, or drive your toes into the ground, really push down, and fling yourself forward. And that can be a really, really, really good way of, of basically reversing direction and baiting your opponent. So, you know, if you're doing some Floyd Mayweather thing, or anything, pulling, you just every time your opponent goes to punch you, just pull your head back slightly, shift your weight, move back, so they feel like they're at a distance, even when they're not. Or, you know, even if you're playing a bit timid, you move back, your opponent starts rushing in, stand, and just launch yourself forward. And that same method is actually a really, really good way to come forward. The only thing we'll suggest with it is if you're doing it in sparring, if you're being careful to not actually hurt your training partners, because it's very easy to gain a lot of power with that. Either try and hit with a bent arm and actually physically retract your arm once you make contact, or if you're worried about training a bad technique, rather than aiming for the head or the body, punch people in the fleshy part of the forearm, which, like smack them in the arm instead, so that you're not actually going to knock someone out unless you mean to, and like keep keep sort of the knockout punches for when there's prize money or alternatively your life's at stake. Because safety first. Cool. Anything else anyone wants to add? All right. So, in that case, we might leave it there, but thank you everyone for coming. So next week we've got a special presentation. We're going to actually have a panel, assuming, which should work out fine with new streaming software. It's going to be myself, Pete Radvan, who did the talk on what reenactment can teach him last year, and Jasper, who came along and just gave a lot of really, really good, really cool insights into Viking Age weapons when I did my talk on Viking Age weapons last year as well. So the three of us are all going to be talking about weapons and warfare in the Viking Age. It's going to be a bit more of a Q&A than necessarily a panel, although we are going to have specific topics we want to cover. It should be a lot of fun. And in the meantime, you can find sort of all of the old lessons on YouTube and on our Facebook page. I'll hopefully see you all next time.